So this is the scene from the Yorkshire Dales, this beautiful look down the road here, and it's wonderful colours. It's an interesting sort of perspective. So for the initial sketch for this scene, I'm going to be using Unipin Sepia fine liners. These are not black, they are brown, and as you can see from some of these examples here, they do give a very different effect. It's a bit softer than your average black fine liner, and I think it's definitely worth having a play with them. And also, if you're doing a sketch just individually with brown, I think it looks quite vintagey. It's quite cool, really. The idea behind this was to go and use a really big brush to do an initial watercolour wash, so I wanted it to be really free and loose. I wanted the initial painting stage to be as organic and big and daft as possible, really. But weirdly, you still have to put down some sense of line work, so at least you know your proportions or the positioning of the subject on the page is kind of roughly right, really. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using that brown fine liner and I'm creating some outlines, I'm creating some zones. So I'm saying this is roughly the outline of the barn, this is roughly the outline of that wall on that side and that wall on that side. But I'm not being too prescriptive because I know full well I'm going to be using super loose watercolour which might run over the lines here. This is a bit of a style exercise in a way, you know, this isn't necessarily how I always work, but it's an investigation into mixing your tools up. You know, often using different tools can give you some really interesting different effects. So that's the kind of rough outline done. So the next stage with this is to think about how I'm going to do these big washes and how I'm going to paint it, really. So look at all these lovely colours here. I think watercolour's beautiful. Sometimes you can look at the palette there and it feels like a work of art in itself. Just a half-used palette is a beautiful thing. Brings me a lot of joy. So what am I doing here? Because it looks like I'm just making a mess, really, but I'm not. What I'm doing is, because I'm going to be using such a big brush, is pre-mix up some big amounts of paint, so I can use a big brush, suck all that paint up and do some big, like lovely big areas and have lots of paint. So really, when you're doing big soft washes and it's all merging together, particularly with a big brush, you know, it's very thirsty, so you really have to mix up quite a bit of paint beforehand. Now if you like this palette, this ceramic palette, I think it's from a company called Maiden, and I actually do use it when I'm doing really big landscape stuff and doing washes as well, ink washes, sorry. And then from the off, I mean, I make a mistake. I think, oh, I'll put some clouds in, but not put any colour in the sky, because I have in my head a kind of vague image of how I want it to look. Now, it would be very easy. After I've done this, I'm looking at it and I'm going, I don't like that at all. But it would be very easy at this point to rip the paper up, or, you know, discard that piece of paper. But I'm determined, really, slightly as an example, to say, right, if you don't like it, you can still keep going with that piece, you can still keep creating. But as I say, you know, this is all about the process. You know, most of art, you know, is about the process. There's lots of things in life that we do because we want the end result, and we have to. But art is, for me, the generation of art is all about enjoying the process and being free in that to make mistakes and just be silly and, you know, and just have fun. So here, as you can see, I'm using this ridiculously oversized brush, which is just a lot of fun in itself, really. I'm still trying to pull out a little bit of pigment where I can when I need it from the little palette. But you see how quickly it sucks up this pigment. And I'm trying to apply the tones of the drawing, you know, the areas where you've had this grey wall here, and the base colour for this grass verges are this natural sienna colour. And I'm just adding some of the tones into the drawing, and that's going to create like a base layer, really, that the whole thing is built upon, if you know what I mean. So adding a little bit more pigment here. I'm not being too precious. I've only put a few lines down, as you can maybe see in the sketch, so it's not too detailed, that, but it's more just sort of remind me of those zones. And obviously I've got the reference picture up here. I can see that as I'm working. So as I'm looking at the reference picture, what I'm doing is I'm squinting my eyes and I'm trying to average down those colours to a sort of a slightly lighter value, if you know what I mean. So if you look at the grass verge there, what I've done is I've squinted my eyes. Now I know I'm going to put darker greens over the top of it, but you can see poking through the green bits of grass, the sort of ground on the background, and that ground is a lighter colour, and it's going to work much easier, and it's going to work much better to have a sort of lighter background and then put, you know, dark features over the top of that. So here I'm adding in just quite a flat green for the for some of the grass in the background there, and then adding in a little bit of green. I could have actually put, I think, a bit more green in there when it comes to handling those grass verges in the foreground, but you know, it's a good experiment. You can see one of the fun things about this big brush is you get some quite interesting marks with it. You get some really big chunky marks. I just want to ask you if you wouldn't mind doing me a favour and hitting that like button. That would be great if you enjoy this, and if you're not a member, please do subscribe as well. It really does help the channel, so thanks guys. So in that top right hand corner there, I've got a little pop of Quinacridone Gold, which is one of my favourite Daniel Smith colours. It really is lovely, and you can mix it with blues and make some really interesting greens. It's a fantastic colour, but I wanted that to be a little bit of a colour pop in that corner. So if you look at my palette now, you can see I've used a lot of paint, and it's just as well I mixed up as much as I did, really. Now while this is drying ever so slightly, I'm adding in a little bit more bits of chunky foliage here where I want it to be. There's several interesting things happening at this point actually in the painting. If you look, we've got an awful lot of liquid on the right hand side, and we've got some of the green coming down into the road. Now it'd be very easy to go in and actually start correcting some of those colour mixes, but I'm not super keen on doing that really here. What I'm looking at more is just values. So I know we've got a lot more dark contrast in the foreground, so I'm adding in a little bit of blue here, and that's just going to help us in future. So now that really just, that's the end of the painting process for that. As you can see, it's a little bit messy. I'm going to let that dry naturally. I'm not going to use the hairdryer on it because otherwise it's just going to get blown all over the place, and I don't really want to do that. So as you can see here, it's dried, and there is not. It's obviously lost a little bit of its punch because that's what watercolour does when it dries. It always dries a tiny bit lighter. Now what I'm using here is Gouache, which is a paint that will cover. It's water soluble, but it will cover watercolour. And I'm just using a little bit of that gouache right at the top there, the horizon, to try and almost push some of the softer elements, you know, towards the back of the picture. And this isn't. This is just playing, you know. I'm just, you know, having a go at this and seeing. I'm just trying to get a feel for how that looks. Now, if it looks a little bit too crunchy, you know, if it looks a little bit like I've got too much on there, you can just lift it out with a tissue. Not quite as effectively as you can with watercolour, actually, but it does help. So now I've got some mixed up some grey here, and I'm going to reinstate that road. I don't mind. This is quite a rough textured paper, so using gouache and rough textured paper can give you some quite nice sort of textural feelings. So what I'm doing is I'm using the gouache on the road here to create a sort of heavier, more like tarmac in terms of its kind of look. So it's just a case of really building up the values now. I'm looking at where the dark areas of the picture are. I'm looking at where we potentially have little bits of shade. Obviously we have the watercolour in the background, and what I'm doing now is primarily working with this grey and the darker values of the gouache to create those real shadow areas. So as we can see now, that's dried, so I have a kind of that between the watercolour and that gouache. It gives me a really nice base. So now I can actually go in and develop a little bit of that line work, because the line work's getting a bit lost, and I don't want it to be a pure painting. I want it to be a mixture of kind of mark making and more painterly sort of strokes. So what I'm doing is I'm going back in with that brown fine liner. I'm starting to redevelop some of those lines, and that's really going to help add a bit of structure back into the piece, really. particularly around the sort of primary element like the barn there, which is something that you're going to probably look at first, and then your eyes going to go off down that road. Now, one of the things I could have done here is I could have perhaps developed the texture on the barn a little bit more in terms of like the brickwork and things like that. And if I was to go back and do this technique again with this sort of scene, I think I would work a little bit more on the texture of some of the stonework. I think in this drawing I was focusing a little bit on the verges more. So once the fine line has been put back in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little bit more watercolour here. And I'm going to start painting in a little bit more of the green that we get in the foreground in the foliage along the roadside, along the verges. So as you get closer to the camera, or the viewer in this case, you know, you're going to get more detail because you're going to see more contrast. So that's one of the little tips I often say when it comes to your artwork is, if you want to think about developing a notion of depth, this idea of real tonal and contrast depth, you really want to keep an idea on what's happening in the foreground, what's happening in the midground, and what's happening at the very back of the picture. And you can really help the viewer understand depth within a picture by putting a lot of your details, you know, there on the foreground. So one of the things I'm doing here, as you can see, is I'm wetting that gouache, because it's actually gone in a little bit rough and I don't want it to be too dominant. And that's one of the beauties about using something like gouache on a watercolour is if you soften it off, it's pigment based and it will behave a little bit like watercolour, or you can put it on thick and it will cover, you know, in the same way that acrylic does. So one of the next stages here is to use the white gouache again. And what I'm doing is I'm painting in that road sign, and then while I've got some paint on the go, I'm looking at adding some sort of textural highlights to the wall, which is going to help sort of develop the shape of it a little bit. And then the next stage really is to add in some more of the lighter and sort of darker areas in the foreground. Again, I'm really working on that grass verge on the right hand side. So what I've done is I've mixed up a little bit of the yellow gouache, where I can actually add in sort of tufts and grass and that sort of textural detail. So I don't know whether you can see there on the left hand side in the palette on the far left bottom corner, I've got some more orangey mixes there, and I'm adding in the dots. I'm trying to do some big dots in the foreground, and as we get further back, make them smaller. I'm also actually putting in a little bit of a highlight on the sort of fields behind, just to add a little bit of a sense of those being a little bit lighter. So really now it's the last finishing touches, and they're just a case of, again with a little bit of, I think I used acrylic on this, a little bit of red acrylic. I just want that little colour pop of the sign. But for me, I really like the contrast between sort of quite countryside and then the built environment, you know. I mean, the barn's not exactly, that's not sprung up organically, has it? You know, that's been built as well. But the colour pop, the only thing I would say is I think I should have kept the sign, but I don't like the location in front of the barn. I actually think the sign would have worked really well a bit further down the road, towards the left-hand side. So it would lead the eye up to the barn, and then you head all the way down the road, and then just before you disappear around the corner, have that little sign there, or maybe another sign there. I think the location of it where it is not so good, but I mean, that's in retrospect, you know. So what I've done is I've let this dry one last time, added in a few more highlights in the grass verge on the right hand side, and then really it's just a case of adding in a last bit of line work. Often you'll think a drawing's finished and then you'll put it down and come back to it 24 hours later and you'll go, oh, do you know what, I can add that, I can do that, I can do that. And the temptation really is to never stop fiddling. But here I've added in a little bit of barbed wire. I could have added a sort of telegraph pole in somewhere, you know, with some pylons, some wires going down the road, which would have been fun. But ultimately, I think the experiment is done. And that's the thing I really like about working this way. And some videos I put up here on YouTube, you know, they are very much this idea of this is how to do something, and this is the great way to do this, and it's really nice when things fit neatly into a step 1, 2, 3, 4. But the reality is, for most of us, when we do our art, is that we're sitting down and we're not really being that structured. You know, what we're doing is we've maybe got a reference drawing and we've got a vague idea of, you know, I've got these acrylics or this gouache and I've got this watercolour, and, you know, should I do a watercolour? Should I do an acrylic? But what we don't necessarily always realise is, and I certainly don't enough, is that you can do both. You know, you can combine these and just play and try some really new things, and just see how this media works together. And mixed media art, you know, particularly in terms of like urban sketching and things like that, is really fun, and it's a great way of developing your style and trying to be a bit bolder and a bit more confident with your mark making. Anyway, I'm babbling. So yeah, the last couple of stages of this drawing, I'm adding in a little bit more watercolour in terms of contrast. I've decided that I need a few more lines, you know, a few more, this is little dots of colour, and then just fiddling with my line work. So there's the finished version. I think it was successful. I think I enjoyed it. There are some elements that I absolutely love in this. I think that grass verge on the right hand side against that wall texturally is really interesting combination. I'm not sure about the Quinacridone Gold in the top right hand corner. I think that's kind of fighting with the rest of it. And I don't think you have to, if you want to have a play with this kind of technique, you know, don't feel you even have to do, you know, a proper drawing. You can certainly do some smaller elements, you know, just sketch out a really simple tree and then try and add in a crazy wash of watercolour, and then add some gouache or acrylic, you know, texture over the top of that, or just do a simple house straight on or something, you know, very, very unchallenging as a drawing, but because the main process is just playing with those materials, and it, you know, playing is definitely the way to go, because then you don't have an end result, you don't have, you know, any metrics to judge your half an hour by. You can just get in a nice sort of flow state and enjoy yourself. So there you go. Now, as always, there is going to be longer versions of this tutorial. Well, it's not really a tutorial, it's more of a play. But anyway, there's longer versions on Patreon, where you can go and subscribe for a few bucks a month and get access to hundreds of my rambling videos. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.